And now, Focus on the Pines with your host, Jack Barnes.
Hi, I'm Jack Barnes, and welcome to Focus on the Pines, where we bring you news, views, and interesting people from in and around Ocean Pines. I'm here in the studio with my cousin, famed watercolor artist of the Eastern Shore, Robert Barnes, with another interesting and fascinating story, this time about some of the German submarines that were off the Eastern Shore or eastern coast of the United States during World War II. A lot of you have driven up Route 1 towards Rehoboth and Bethany Beach and seen those big concrete towers up there located right on the beach with the slits in them. They were part of this fascinating history in World War II. And Bob, tell us a little bit about some of these German submarines that all we've done is ever seen them in movies.
Well, the towers you're talking about, I said, it's hard for people to put themselves in what was at that time and what is today. Our early warning system today is satellites, etc. And if when we were at odds with the Soviet Union, if they launched a missile of some kind, then our early warning system, we knew it had been launched within seconds of when it was launched. You go back to 1942, and we were at war, of course, at war with Germany, and the Germans had an awful large U-boat activity that was right off of our coast. Those towers were our early warning system, if you can appreciate it. In other words, what it was line of sight from the top of that tower out in the ocean, at being able to actually spot submarine activity. The submarine activity that went on the East Coast was a little bit different than what Hollywood has portrayed. The activity was here. However, the submarines did not use, nor did they want to use, their torpedoes, because torpedoes was a commodity that was hard to come by, and of course they had to travel a long ways to get them. And they wanted to hold the torpedoes to use for warships if they happened to run into some warships. But what their activity was on the East Coast, and this is true, we have a line of ships sunk from New York, and they're almost bumper to bumper, so to speak, from there to Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. And here's what they were doing, is supplies that were being used in the war effort that was being transported from one part of the United States to some of the manufacturing areas of the United States, and they would stop these merchant vessels. The merchant vessels were sometimes coastal freighters, and a lot of stuff was moved by barge, being towed by tugboats. And the barges that were being used at the time, a lot of times families would live on the barges, because the barge did not have any power, but it did have rudder, and the man that had that job, he would help navigate it up the Delaware Bay or the Hudson River or somewhere like that, and to do that, a lot of times they would take their families right with them, and they had a little building built right on the back of the barge, and they lived in it. But these they would stop these merchant vessels, be it freighter or tugboat, barge, or whatever.
Now they being the German submarines.
They being the German subs, they would surface and stop these people. And then, as I said, Hollywood hasn't portrayed it this way, but a lot of the Germans were I don't know what the word would be, but anyhow, they would insist that the crew get off of the vessel, get on a lifeboat of some kind, and start inshore. And
it was like honor among seamen in the early days of the war.
Yeah, they weren't trying to kill people; they were just trying to get those raw materials on the bottom of the ocean so they couldn't be used by the United States in the war effort. And and then they would take their deck gun and put a shell below the waterline, and there it would sink. As a matter of fact, there's one story of one happening off of Cape Hatteras, and Diamond Shoals is a treacherous piece of water, and they stopped this vessel and told them they had to get off, and that they were going to sink the vessel, and the weather was changing. It was getting ready to go bad. Well, the crew of this merchant vessel was so excited they got a lifeboat overboard, but they had two lifeboats. They had one that had no power, and one that did have power on it. It had a gasoline engine on it. They got in the wrong one. They got into one with no power, and here they are rowing to get away from the vessel. And the Germans, as the story was related to me, the Germans knew that they weren't going to make it before the weather turned really sour and they were going to be in jeopardy, because there they are beyond Diamond Shoals. They had to go through Diamond Shoals to get to land. And to stop them, they had to put a shell over their bow and make them turn around and trade boats.
Is that right?
To get in the power boat, because the power boat they had a chance of making it. So that was one of the stories that went on. Well, what I wanted to relate with here is related to Ocean City. There was a gentleman, when I came to Ocean City, I met him. I was diving then, and he was a fisherman. His name was Louis Russell. Louis Russell, as a matter of fact, the home that he had, which is right down on what is now Sunset Avenue, but at that time was called North Harbor Road. He had that house, and his family lived there. And to this day, his daughter is still living, and she still lives in that house today, Mary Lou. Well, Louis, and we're going to go back in times that I'm not supposed to remember, but of course I've talked to Louis and get it. In 1933, when the inlet was cut through here, now we have opened to a different fishery. Before we were all doing all pound fishing. Now we're open to trawlers and so on to get in the ocean.
And pound fishing was done right off the beach.
That's right. Pound fishing was done right off the beach. And they had to launch the vessels right through the surf to get to them. But now with an inlet, we could get offshore and fish. But we had no fishermen with that kind of experience up here. So Davis and Lynch Fish Company, which is out of business now, but Davis and Lynch Fish Company, which was down on the harbor.
And it was located almost where Ake Marine is today.
That's exactly right, exactly where Ake Marine, or about where Ake Marine is today, is they recruited a fisherman from Chincoteague. And one of the fishermen they recruited was Louis Russell. Louis Russell was a bass fisherman, had a boat named the Two Brothers. And Louis came here in 1937, the year I was born. But anyhow, Louis came here in 1937 and was fishing offshore here. Louis knew more about the bottom of the ocean than any man I've ever met in my life. At that time, the locations were pinpointed we did not have global
Positioning system.
positioning, and so locations were by how long you've been running, at what speed, in what direction by your compass, and then you read the bottom. And Lewis could read it like it was the palm of his hand. But anyhow, Lewis came up and was fishing. When war came along, one of the things that happened was all private pilots on the coast. Now, inland this wasn't true, but all private pilots on the coast, if you had an airplane, you couldn't fly your plane anymore. As a matter of fact, I knew people who had taken their aircraft and taken the wings off of them and put them in storage, so to speak, because you could not fly out over the coast. Because of these spotters, they didn't know whether you were good or bad or what, so they kept all of the people we knew were good on the land.
Right.
So anyhow. And the same thing was true with boating. There was no pleasure boating being done offshore at the time. However, they did allow commercial fishing. Okay, on an occasion, Lewis was offshore fishing. Now, Lewis relates this to me, and I talked to Pinky Parker, who was manager of Davison Lint, and so on, and this is all absolute gospel. And Lewis was offshore fishing, and a tugboat was headed north with a large barge behind it, and this German sub surfaced and stopped them. Lewis is sitting over there. He said they paid no attention to him whatsoever. It's like he didn't exist, but he was well within a sight of what was going on, and he observed everything that was happening. The Germans had the crew of the tug and the barge at gunpoint, hands on their head, and they were in the process of getting them to get a boat prepared so they could come inshore, and they were going to sink the tug and the barge. When all of a sudden someone came out of the wheelhouse of the tugboat with a pistol in his hand.
Whoa.
When that happened, they shot everyone that was on both on the tug and the barge. Killed everybody. I don't recall how many it was, but it was quite a number. We're talking about probably 8, 10 people, something like that. And then they put a shell below the waterline of the tug, they put a shell below the waterline of the tug, and then they left. The two vessels, of course, were immediately taken on water and were sinking. When the Germans left, Lewis moved up to where they were, and he got the bodies. By that time, they were in the water. Some of them were in the water, but anyhow, he got all the bodies, and they were put on. He put them on his boat, and then they moved inshore. And he always packed out at Davison Lint, and that's where he packed out that day. But anyhow, he comes in. He's got all these dead people with him. Now this is, boy, the difference in the way things happened then, the way things would happen today, is unbelievable. I'm thinking about what kind of an investigation do you think would go on an incident like that? They took the bodies off, and they put them in like a truck body, and they got the ice plant to bring over ice, and they iced all the bodies down. They put ice down, put the bodies on the ice, and then ice down the bodies. And of course the authorities were notified. But it took days for them to come and retrieve the bodies. It was so big. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was a big deal, but it was nothing like we would imagine would go on today.
Sure.
And Anyhow, that happened right off the coast here, right off of Ocean City. Also, when I was a child, and I'm relating this to the submarine activity that went on. When I was a child, the Barrier Islands, which of course Ocean City is one, Assateague being one, but then you get down to my home in Virginia, and there's Cedar Island, Paramore Island, Hog Island, Cobb Island, etc. And you could go out to those islands, and my grandfather has taken me out there many times. And you go out to those islands, and sometimes, especially after dark, you could see it. But anyhow, you could witness the war going on. You'd see it was a flash, and then you'd hear the noise. And all this was naval battles that was going on close enough that we could see the flashes. I'm not saying you see the individual ships. Also, at that time, the Barrier Islands off of Virginia, especially, and of course, to be aware, they were uninhabited, so therefore if it came ashore at Ocean City, it was picked up right away. But those islands, they become littered with wreckage from some of the vessels that were sunk. The other thing, I have a piece of it. Anyhow. If you recall, there are life rafts. The life rafts are pretty big, but they're made of cork.
Sure.
Okay. It was during those years that our decoy carvers,
Like the Ward brothers.
And folks like that, but anyhow, a lot of others. During those years, you see, wood became, well, it was rationed, as a matter of fact. It became hard to come by to be able to carve decoys. Decoys was not a thing of art at that time. It was a method of putting food on the table. It was a tool. And at that time is when cork bodies became and they were where people would go out there and see one of those big life rafts, and they'd cut sections out of it, and they would carve ducks out of that. And I have a section of one of the it's been cut off, but I have a section of the cork that they would use these in. This was going. I relate this because you see, I think it's a lot, especially people that are young, but it's hard to understand how close World War II was to us. I mean, it was not something that was happening in some European or Asian country. It was here. As God bless, it didn't get on our land. It did, however, in Oregon. There was a family that was killed in Oregon. But anyhow, we didn't get it on our land here. Now, my father worked in the shipyards in Norfolk during the war. And so one day, like my granddad would take me to the Barrier Islands from time to time. My grandfather one day came by our house and said, they've just captured a German sub near Hampton Roads. And the Hampton Roads is where the entire Atlantic Fleet would tie up, see. And they captured a German sub at Hampton Roads, and asked my mother if he could take me down there so I could watch the activities of them being taken in shore. Mother gave her permission, and my granddad took off with me, and down Hampton Roads we went. When we got to Hampton Roads, there was a lot of things that were, you have to appreciate, I'm observing this through a child's mind. And, you know, a child, there are things that don't register with a child like it would with an adult, and there's things that are registered with a child, it's not registering with an adult. So anyhow, when we get there, the sub is in tow. The forward deck is lined with crew members.
These are German. It's the
It's
German sub, German crew members on the
German
deck.
sailors, and they're lined, two lines, got the whole forward deck from the conning tower forward on this sub. They're standing there with their hands on their heads. On either side of the tug is an American naval vessel, small, and on this vessel they have sailors standing there, and I know what the guns were, because it's really funny how this happened, me being an artist. There are different shapes in our history that has run to the point that it is a what I want to say is a memorable shape. It's a classic shape.
We see it, we recognize it. Right?
One of the things, so people understand what I'm talking about, one of the things is a 300 SLR Mercedes that had the gull wing doors.
Sure.
That's a shape that
James
will live
Bond.
forever. Exactly. Another shape was a Thompson submachine gun. It was 45 caliber. It had, like the FBI used the G-Man stuff. And of course, I thought they were the neatest things in the world. As a matter of fact, I had one that looked exactly like a real one, except it was a toy, you know. And that's what these sailors were standing on these naval vessels.
On either side of the German
On
submarine.
either side. And as a child, I was thinking, God, they're all wrong. Because if they have to shoot, they're pointing at each other, and we can have casualties. You know, they can shoot each other.
Sure.
But anyhow, they came in, nobody had to shoot. They offloaded they tied the sub up, and they offloaded the crew, and the crew was put on a gray, of course, Navy, a gray school bus type of thing. And then off they went. Near Norfolk was a POW camp, and it was said that's where they took them. But anyhow. So we watched the sub being tied up and so on. We watched the crew being taken off. And now the show's over with, so my granddad took me home. 1 week later, Granddad comes to my mom again and said, look, they're allowing people to go aboard that sub. Going to cost 50 cents to go aboard it. And I want to take Bobby down and we go aboard the sub if that's okay, Mom. Fine. So we go down. Now, as an adult, this is the reason this puzzles me. If we captured an enemy submarine today, how long do you think it would be before the public was invited to go aboard? I mean, it's just unbelievable. But that's beside the point. When I got there, like I said, wood was rationed. That was hard to come by. There was a beautiful floating dock that went from shore out on the submarine, made out of wood. But the way it was is as the sub would rise and lower in the tide, the dock would rise and lower also. So we went on board, and I don't know whether my granddad had to pay for me or not, but anyhow, he paid. And we went on board, and we were walking all through, and it was really close quarters, even for a child. But the thing that is upmost in my mind, and is today, is this brass rail. And that's all I could see. It was a lot of machinery, but this shiny, shiny brass rail. Well, when I got grown, I realized that the brass rail was around waist height to an adult, but it was right in front of my eyes. I had to look over it or under it all the time. And anyhow, we look at the sub, and then off we come, and my granddad takes me home. it was no time. It may even been that week, and of course I was too young to be reading the papers, but my granddad would let know what was going on, and my mom and dad would too, but my grandfather especially. And he read this to me, and the other thing that interested me was I thought the money that was collected,
The 50 cents.
yeah, would go to war bonds, because we were always having war bond drives, and we always collecting pots and pans and stuff, and
Sure.
I was in the middle of that always, collecting all sorts of junk and stuff to go for the war effort. I really felt like I was doing my duty. So I thought that money would go for war drum. It wasn't. The money was used to buy toilet articles, shaving material, stationery, stamps, envelopes, writing material, and so on for the POWs. So
Bet your grandfather.
yeah, so
was
there we
like
were.
that.
You know, we were like raising money for them to have a better life. Anyhow, so my granddad reads to me that when they took the crew off of that sub, and of course, once they take the crew off, they were searched, etc., and so on. That of all the crew that was on the sub, 50% of them had a half ticket. You know, when you go to the movies, how they tear the ticket in half and give it to you. That 50% of the Germans on that sub had a half ticket to the Lowe's Theater on Granby Street in Norfolk.
Is that right? They were going in seeing the movies.
Yeah, well, they figured that what happened was they literally would take a small rubber thing or something, and they were allowing a few of them to have shore leave. And the way it was in the United States, where we are a melting pot, if somebody was walking down the street in Norfolk and speaking German, it wouldn't
Didn't
mean
faze
anything.
them.
Wouldn't mean anything at all. But if we reverse that, and you put somebody in the middle of Berlin at that day and let them walk down the street speaking English, they'd be arrested in a heartbeat.
Amazing.
It is amazing. I've just always, that has fascinated me. It wasn't the same sub, but it was later years. It was later years when I was a lot older. And I read a human interest story in the Norfolk Virginia Pilot. And the caption was, "The first time I saw my hometown." And what this was a German U-boat skipper. And it was during 1942, 1943, somewhere in there. He was surfaced in the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, charging his batteries at night. Of course, the old submarines underwater, they were electric. And so they had to keep the battery charged or they couldn't operate. And they were above the water with the engines running, charging their batteries.
At the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay.
Right in the entrance of Chesapeake Bay, and he said he could see the lights because there was no blackout at that particular time. He could see the lights of Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Hampton Roads, all that area. And that's what he was looking at. And he said, listening to the radio. And the radio came on and said, "This is Cape Henry Lookout. No U-boat activities in sight." And he said as soon as that was in front of him, and as soon as that one went over with, then behind him was Cape Charles Lookout, no U-boat activities in sight. And he was sitting in between the two of them, charging his batteries. It was some years later, it was well after the war, that he immigrated. And lo and behold, it was the Tidewater area of Virginia that he made his home. And this story he wrote about it, it must have been maybe 20 years after that. But anyhow, I read that story myself. But
Well, I'll tell you, this has just been some fascinating history, and I appreciate again sharing this with our viewers, and it's just amazing how this brings some of the war close, and realize that at the Eastern Shore it may have been a lot closer than it was inland. And we want to thank again our guest today, artist and historian Robert Barnes, for sharing some of that history with you. This is Jack Barnes for Focus on the Pines.
Thank you.